We ready?
She's going live.
Amy's going.
Yep, as we speak.
We're live here.
All right, good morning, 9 a.m., Friday, February 9th. This is the Beach Preservation Ad Hoc Committee meeting. I'd like to call the meeting to order and acknowledge that the press and public were duly notified of the meeting in accordance with the Freedom of Information Act. Why don't we, everybody may know each other, but real quick, why don't we just do a quick round of introductions?
Andrew Vega?
Cindy Solomon.
Dan Slotchaber.
Scott Pierce.
Katie Myers.
Elizabeth Campson.
Tim Momuti.
Desiree Fragoso.
Douglas Carr. Stephen Drainham.
Thank you. And Stephen's with CSE, our coastal engineer group that's been working with us for a number of years.
Mayor, can you pull your microphones closer to you and your sharing just kind of feel this person next to you?
Thank
Need
you.
to be like 2 or 3 inches from your mouth.
All right, so real quick, let's just run through, this was in the email that was sent out to you from a committee goal and objectives and timelines. Today is more of a orientation to some extent and level setting and ground setting, and then we'll talk about, you know, kind of next steps and when to meet, how often to meet, who you might want to get in front of us from a technical expert in addition to Stephen. So it's kind of today is just really some foundation and level setting and ground setting. So again, just quick review of our goals and objectives. We want to review the beach restoration policies and practices and provide recommendations. We're going to develop recommendations for a more proactive response to beach erosion and develop recommendations for new, consistent future needs and projects. I know we've got, you know, Breach Inlet, Beachwood East right in front of us. This committee, we need to pick our heads up a little bit and look future, as opposed to Stephen's going to do a little bit of review of the past on efforts that have happened, but this committee's charge is really to think about the future, and council is going to take up the emergency procedure on Tuesday, so we'll kind of let that run its course. So this conversation, and as we walk forward, is really more about the future and how we attack it maybe differently. So Douglas, you wanted to do the beachfront jurisdictional line review for us, just kind of level set and make sure we're on the same page.
Should I just use this up here? Is that up here? Is it on?
Not yet.
Am I in your way, Kate?
No, you're good.
So this is the mayor's favorite graphic. He loves the whiteboard. Likes to kind of scratch things out and talk them over. So what we've drawn here, this is my handiwork, so if you want to criticize it, I'll accept it. Just a standard kind of oceanfront subdivision. We have the road out here to orient you. These pink squares are the houses. Pink kind of blob is a pool. And then out here on the bottom is the ocean. This is a dynamic, this mean high water line is a dynamic line. On most properties, it also is the seaward limit of the property line. So these properties, they actually fluctuate in size as this line comes and goes. Working inward, we have, or landward, I should say, we have the OCRM baseline. It was most recently established 2018. 20 feet in from that, we have the setback line.
Sorry to interrupt you. Can you just go for our information and for the public's information, how these, like how often these are determined and things? You got some notes up there that probably
Yes.
everybody can't see.
So this line, the baseline is established every 7 to 10 years. They did it in 2018. They're starting to reestablish that line, I think now, 2014. They'll begin that process. The setback line is simply a measurement landward of that baseline. For almost everywhere on the island, it's 20 feet in from the baseline.
So if the baseline changes, the setback changes
Yes.
Correct.
automatically?
Correct.
Can I add a couple of comments to that just for clarification? The baseline along a unstabilized inlet zone, which affects the eastern and southern part of the island, and that's something that's designated by OCRM, is determined this way where the baseline is set where the shoreline position was most landward over the past 40 years. The baseline along the central portion of the island is located along the crest of the primary dune. So it doesn't look at that 40-year criteria, it looks at what the current dune line is. And then the setback line is a multiplier of the local erosion rate. It's a 40 times multiplier of that local erosion rate. However, if the beach is stable or accretional, then they apply a 20-foot minimum. So I think at like Beechwood and the eastern end of the island, the setback line is much more than 20 feet landward of the baseline.
And by statute today, that line can only move landward, will not move seaward.
The inlet zones start at about 6th. Where do they're somewhere kind of in the
Somewhere around there. I could
6 on the
pull it up.
southern end, and then
The Dewey's.
yeah, and then Dewey's Inlet
Somewhere around the Grand Pavilion, maybe a
Grand
little
Pavilion.
west of there.
So that was a good point. Thank you.
There's a,
Katie.
there's a map, is there a handy link to that?
Yes,
'Cause that is very,
If you Google OCRM jurisdictional
Educational.
lines, it pops up a web page, and halfway down on there, there's a link to a map viewer that shows you where those lines are.
And Douglas, what's the purpose of a baseline and the setback for building or whatever?
Yep. So, well, and we've also added a maximum building line, which complicates things a little bit. But generally speaking, OCRM, the state agency that OCRM controls pretty much anything that happens seaward of their setback line, and the city controls anything that happens landward of their setback line. So this is really where we, and if an issue comes up out on the beach, the city kind of first thing we do is we reach out to OCRM and we see where their jurisdiction begins and ends to know, is this an issue that the state's going to deal with, or is it an issue that the city's going to deal with? I'll come back to OCRM jurisdiction. We have this other kind of wild card active beach jurisdiction, which ebbs and flows literally with the shoreline. So I'll come back to that in just a second. So we'll working again towards the road. We then have a maximum building setback line. That is pretty well independent of the ocean. I mean, this is a thing that's any zoning district is going to have their setbacks in terms of where you can build your house. On the ocean, and this is pretty tailored, this graphic, to Ocean Boulevard. There is a maximum building line that the houses had to comply with, but pools were not required to comply with that. So, and I should say in-ground pools were not. So you do have some in-ground pools that are landward of that maximum building line, but then you have some that are seaward of that max building line. But in every instance, they should be landward of OCRM's jurisdiction, because OCRM will not allow you to build a pool in their jurisdiction. So
My question, does the city code have any restrictions as to how far away from the home the pool can be, or how close to the setback line it should be?
there is, yes, there's a side setback. There's a minimum separation here, but it's only a 3-foot separation requirement, 6 feet here, and then as long as you are landward of OCRM's jurisdiction, and Ocean Boulevard pretty much go as close to the ocean as you would have chosen with your pool.
And Douglas, again, to your point, this is, because it's different on different parts of the island as far as this max build line or some of these others, right? This is
Yeah.
really a snapshot of Ocean Boulevard.
Yeah, and this is pretty consistent for all of the non-Wild Dunes properties.
Got it.
When you're between 21st and 41st, the pools had to go on this side of that blue line, but generally it's very similar for everything until you get into Wild Dunes. When you get into Wild Dunes, those properties don't extend to the mean high water. There is a communal property that's between the houses and the ocean. So they are very different in Wild Dunes. But outside of Wild Dunes is a pretty typical configuration.
Douglas, could you just speak to where the lines, the OCRM setback and baseline lines are in Wild Dunes? That's a question.
Yeah. So and it really starts at about 53rd, 54th. That line, it gradually moves closer and closer to the homes, and you can see that it kind of compresses the homes up to the road at about 53rd, 54th, and then eventually it actually goes across the road. And so at that point, those houses that got built in OCRM's jurisdiction had to go through an additional permitting process of getting a building permit from OCRM for their entire house. So most of the problem areas in Wild Dunes that we think of, their entire structure, their entire lot, all of it is seaward of OCRM's jurisdiction. Yeah, so their houses are out, kind of out here, not in the ocean, but in that area. Some are close. Yeah. So this top green line is 250 feet from the mean high water line. That again, because this line is dynamic, this line is also dynamic. It's moving as this line moves. This line is moving because it's directly 250 feet from that line. This is the area that, this is the line that creates the city's erosion control setback line. So, and as I think everybody in the room probably knows, council is considering amending this, but this is the way the ordinances are written now.
Douglas,
In
can
this,
I ask one quick question
Yeah.
for everybody? The mean high water line being dynamic, whereas these are calculated every 6 years or whatever, how dynamic is it? Is it daily, weekly, monthly, yearly?
we've actually, Stephen, I think we've talked about how, and I think there's a little bit of uncertainty about how that gets exactly computed. I think it's an elevation. I think it relates to kind of a 2.3 elevation, but how frequently does that line move?
It is kind of a legal gray area, because if you look at the definition of mean high water, if you're looking at a datum-based mean high water, that's the still water elevation where you don't look at waves and the beach run up. And a lot of times, that's not what is used by OCRM to define mean high water. Mean high water is the wave run up limit, which is where, kind of the last high tide reaches. And again, that's kind of a gray area. But OCRM would.
For the definition of mean, you have to have a data set to calculate mean. What is that data set?
So it would be the normal high tide line over normal weather conditions that you're likely to see on a normal spring tide event. OCRM does have kind of a policy that if a major storm impacts a beach, they won't use that storm or the line within 18 months. So if a storm hits and sets the dune back 30 feet, if it's a major storm, then they won't set a new line there. But if it's just a chronically eroding beach, then essentially it is a daily progression that if they go out there and look at an escarpment line on a dune, then they would say that that's their new mean high water line.
So is it over 18 months of data, or is it over?
That would be an
I'm
instantaneous.
not
It would be more of a daily, just when they go out there to look, they would establish based off of what the beach looks like that day, where they think the mean high water should be. And it's not a very precise, assessment sometimes.
Yeah, from a layman's position, when I go out to the beach, if it's soft, unpacked sand, you kind of know the tide is not getting there daily. So you're landward of the mean high tide when you're down and you're in the hard packed and clearly water's getting there daily. You're then below mean high tide, but in terms of laser point accuracy,
I was just trying to figure out how long
The duration
long
of-
of a duration do you calculate the mean? And I just can't, it
Yeah,
sounds
it's-
like it's subjective. I'll just leave it at that. Okay,
It's an old common law term.
Yeah.
yeah, okay, never mind. I'll not bog us down.
So this line, 250 feet from that line, is the landward limit of the erosion, the city's erosion control policies. And then wherever OCRM's jurisdiction is where the city's jurisdiction ends on erosion control or anything else, and the state's jurisdiction begins. And to kind of go back to their jurisdiction and talk just quickly about this kind of wild card of active beach jurisdiction, and this is being challenged, and there's I think there's current cases over this exact issue. But as OCRM currently administers this, and we understand their administration, if there is an erosional episode in this shoreline, which is typically seaward of their jurisdiction, but if it comes up and becomes landward of their stationary lines, OCRM will claim that they now have jurisdiction in this new area. So we would understand that their jurisdiction, and then once the erosion line goes seaward of their setback line, then their setback line becomes, so that this would be kind of how their jurisdiction, how they operate in terms of determining where their jurisdiction begins and ends. So on the southern end, the vast majority of those properties, OCRM would say, this is now the controlling line, is this active beach line. When you get up to, beyond the pier into the middle of the island, then and really for the rest of the island, all the way up to Wild Dunes, you then are looking for their setback line in terms of where their jurisdiction begins. Again, this is there are cases over this issue, and we're following those, but we're operating within the rules as we understand them. Any questions on those?
Is this part of the, I think in 2018, they went from a retreat to a hold the line? Now- Preservation?
Yeah, there were a little bit of, and Stephen, in terms of the tweaks to I don't know that there were a lot of tweaks to the line other than their jurisdictional lines. I mean, I know that this policy of never going seaward again, I think that was new. I don't think there's any real meaningful change in policy from retreat to preservation in these lines. I think these lines are pretty much done the way they've always been done, as I understand it. I think they are starting, if you look at their site, I think they started January 2024 to establish the new setback line and baseline. I think that generally takes them 3 years or so to actually go through the process of doing it.
We're up
So-
for 26.
So yeah, I think that kind of puts them 26, 27 in reestablishing these lines.
I got one, just to make sure I understand it correctly. So if you have an event that moves the line further up, kind of like the one you've drawn,
Yep.
and then we do a big beach renourishment, and
Yes.
the beach goes back to what it was 5 years ago,
Right.
they still retain that new land.
They do not, well, so the way we understand what we understand is when this gets repaired, this area returns, and they use terms of being stabilized. We hear vegetation, it's not being inundated. So once this kind of returns to a normal condition, their line, this active beach jurisdiction goes away. Their line then returns back to the baseline. But I think, and I could be wrong, that the next time they draw those lines, they probably are going to move in an inlet area. They're supposed to move it to the seawardmost limit, the landwardmost limit that the sea has come in the last 40 years. So my understanding of that would be this would now become the new permanent setback line. And Stephen, do you have experience that tells you if they do?
That, that's
they
my
do that?
understanding as well, that whether it accretes naturally or from a artificial project, that it would restore back to the setback line. But like you said, once the lines are redrawn, they could use that shoreline unless it was due to a storm event. And, you know, that's where you'd have the opportunity to comment on their recommendations and go through that process.
With the last storms that we've had, would that be an event storm?
The one in December, I mean, I think there's a strong case that you can make for that. I don't know that they've preemptively said, yes, this is a storm that we would consider. We also had Hurricane Idalia that was a big impact, especially on the south end. So there have been several storms that you could point to, but it's also kind of been a chronically eroding shoreline over the past 12 months-ish as well. So it's up for debate.
All right.
Thank you,
Good.
Douglas. Yeah, appreciate that. Good, good level set. Oh. You okay over there?
I'm okay. Attack
one-eyed
Mike.
Scott.
Attack Mike, yeah. I got another eye.
I failed to mention up front, we're going to try to keep these meetings to an hour so that we can be respectful of y'all's time.
Save
and
that board.
Yeah, save that for you. We're going to memorialize that in some form or fashion. So next, we've asked Stephen to give an overview of beach preservation efforts and discussion of medium and long-term options to consider. So again, just kind of a level set on where we've been and some options for moving forward. So Stephen, thanks for joining us.
Okay, and thanks for having me down here. I think this is a good opportunity to get a group together and just discuss, you know, long-term efforts here. I'm going to kind of reset and go back through the past little over 15 years that we've been working down here. Look either direction is comfortable. I'm not going to try to belabor the point. I know some of you have heard a lot of this before, so please stop me at any time if you have any questions. I'm going to go through fairly quickly just for the sake of time. But Isle of Palms is a inlet-dominated system where you're getting the majority of your sediment supply from Dewey's Inlet through this process called shoal bypassing, where sand from Dewey's Island and further north falls into the Dewey's Inlet channel. The ebb currents push that sand out into the ocean, and then waves are constantly trying to push that sand back up towards the beach. The way that happens is the sand kind of coalesces into a shoal, which then waves move onto the beach as a clear unit. And that process repeats itself anywhere from every 5 to 10 years. And we know very well, you know, why that process is going on and that it's going to happen, but what we can't tell you is exactly the time frame from one shoal to the next. We can't tell you exactly how much sand, you know, one shoal is going to contain, and the configuration of that shoal, which determines how the beach is going to respond. When that shoal is offshore, it acts like a breakwater. If you were to install an armor stone breakwater offshore, that shoal is breaking waves, and the waves are reflecting and refracting around that shoal. So it changes the wave dynamics of approaching the coast, and you end up with erosional arcs on either side. And you can get the same thing somewhat going on at the Isle of Palm side of Breach Inlet, but it's not near as significant. It's much smaller processes that move on the northern side there. Now, Sullivan's Island has very large-scale shoals that are attaching to their beach. But the northern side along our beaches, you tend to have less of these distinct events. But this photo here from 1997 shows a significant shoal that had attached right to the center of the Wild Dunes area, right at the property owner's beach house. That's typically kind of the ground zero for these attachments. They can move further north up to Mariners Walk and Shipwatch, but can attach further south, almost as far down as the Grand Pavilion. But this is the classic, you know, kind of textbook example of the worst case situation for the beach, where you have a lot of sand building out behind the shoal because waves are not hitting the beach there. But the wave refraction has caused erosion on both sides. Once all that sand fully merges on, then it naturally restores the beach. But what we've seen in the past 20 years is that volume has not been sufficient to completely restore all the sand that's being moved out of the system over time. So even though you're getting sand, if you add up all the sand over time, you're still at a net deficit, and that's why we've had to do the nourishment projects, is to supplement that. And you're also having to do the nourishment projects to try to restore the beach while these processes are going on. And you may see erosion rates of 200 feet per year in some of these conditions, and at the same time see accretion rates of that same magnitude behind the shoal. Actually, on this photo, I will show that you can see right below this green arrow, there's some kind of track marks in the shoal. That was a sand harvesting project that was done in the late 90s to try to move some of that sand to the erosional areas to help combat some of the critical erosion going on. This is what it looks like as that sand moves on shore over time. They can move anywhere from 500 to 800 feet per year towards the beach. So if you look at the 2010 conditions here in this tan area, the leading edge of the shoal, you can just see kind of keeps jumping and stair-stepping closer to the beach and increasing in elevation. As it gets higher in elevation, it tends to slow down a little bit because it takes more effort to move all that sand. And the beach is building out behind it, as we see. That one attached in later 2014, and we did another shoal management project then. Looking at some of the history, there actually are some groins up. This is the 41st Avenue is here on the left side of the image. 53rd Avenue is here in the right center. There's some, we know we saw some groins up here several years ago after Hurricane Matthew, but there's actually several more that are buried. And there's a seawall along the stretch of beach south of 53rd Avenue. Right now, there's probably about 600 feet of dunes in that same area, and a lot of that's from the sand that's moved from projects in recent years. Down here on the bottom, there's an incredibly large shoal attachment event that happened in 1949, and it took almost 20 years to fully merge with the shoreline. There was actually a marsh area forming between the old beach and the outer bar of the shoal. And by 1963, it's fully attached and restored some of the east end of the island. So it's been going on a long time. Again, there's been really large events in the past, smaller scale events, and it's just something that has to be maintained on a case-by-case basis. So some of the project history, in 1983, there was a nourishment project that used sand from the marina dredging that pumped sand across the island and restored some of the beach area along Wild Dunes. The periodic sand scraping from shoals occurred through the 80s and 90s, and then our first large-scale offshore event was in 2008, and that was about a $10 million project that moved 900,000 yards of sand. Before that project, there were about 13,000 large sandbags along Wild Dunes. We had to document the removal of all those during the project, and this is the Ocean Club building there in the center image here. This was a dead low tide picture. There was still 2 feet of water up against the sandbags all the time. So that was done in 2008 and 2012. We had a small scale sand scraping event to try to relocate some sand from the accretional area in Wild Dunes to some of the erosional areas. And then 2014, 2015, we had a larger scale where we moved 240,000 yards. And that bought enough time until the 2018, the last large-scale project.
Which was about 1.7 million cubic yards of sand.
Yeah, it was just a little under 1.7 million, about $14 million. 15, yeah, plus or minus. I will say that the 2014-2015 project utilized sand from the shoal as it was attaching, but we moved about 80,000 yards of sand from the area around 53rd Avenue and recycled some of that back to the north. And we think that was an effective way to, again, do some recycling of sand to get it back to original areas where it stays within the system and it'll move back through that area over time. As soon as we stopped excavating sand, the beach immediately started building back out in that area. So these are the erosion hotspots that we tend to have to deal with at the east end. It's the Beechwood and Dunecrest area are kind of the focus on the west side, the Ocean Club area, because that building then tends to stick out further is the area on the east side of the Wild Dunes area. And then lately we've obviously been dealing with the south end. I'll kind of skip through that. I will say one of the big things that caught us up with this 2018 project is the State Historic Preservation Office between the 2008 and 2018 project, got some funds to start doing some studies offshore and found, well, they knew things were out there, but got much more concerned about the Second Stone Fleet, which was a blockade effort during the Civil War where they filled up some old whaling vessels with stones and sunk them offshore to try to help in the blockade. And they did that in some very good sediment sources for future nourishment. So we had to coordinate with them to try to find sufficient sand that was beach compatible off there. And we were able to find a source that was outside of their proposed area, but moving forward, we're going to have to coordinate with them to try to collect additional data to be able to utilize some of the sand resources around those wrecks, because there's only so much good material out there that's in a good spot where it's fairly cheap to move. So we actually have a meeting with them on Monday to, as part of our scope in planning this upcoming project, is to help supplement some of the work they've done to fill in some of the gaps so that they can restrict or shrink the area that they're concerned about. So that was the 2018 project. Again, it was about 1.7 million yards. I stole a couple of slides from a presentation I gave at the Beach Advocates meeting last week, but the past 10 to 15 years has just been a much, really about the past 7 years, has been a much more energetic time and much more erosional condition up and down the coast of South Carolina. We've had 30 named storms over the past 10 years that have impacted the state. We've had 7 FEMA declared disasters, where we only had 3 from 2000 to 2012. And all those were in 2004 from tropical storms. So we're seeing in a lot of areas that have been stable for a long time, they're having erosion issues that they've never had before. The center part of Kiowa Island, parts of the Grand Strand. So it's been a significant change, and one potential reason for that is sea levels have also risen by 5 to 6 inches over the past 15 years, which has been a substantial jump. And I'll just throw this slide real quick. Is the blue line is the predicted tides. If you go to the NOAA tide tables over the past 10 years, the orange line is the actual measured data. And you can see over the past 10 years how the orange line has shifted further and further above the blue line. And all that is a result of sea levels are increasing. So the tide's not, what used to be a -1 low tide, a big low tide, now only goes down to 0 feet. And what used to be a 6-foot tide is now a 6.5-foot tide. So if you look at your tide predictions and make your judgments off of that, you really need to add about 6 inches for every tide based off of the sea level rise.
And Stephen, last year, most of the high tide events that we saw were about a foot, sometimes even two feet over the predicted.
Right. What kind of spurred us on to look at this data in detail was when we're dealing with Breach Inlet and we're trying to say, you know, if we're scraping up a dune or bringing in sand, how's it going to perform? We're looking at the tides, and even on good weather days, we were seeing the tides were still 6 inches to a foot above the predicted tide. And even when wind's blowing offshore, you would expect the tide to be close to predicted. And that's not what we were seeing. So we dug into it, and that's what kind of came out of that talk.
So this may be a dumb question, but with a chart like that, is somebody going to change their prediction methodology sometime soon? I mean, we got 10 years of this.
Yeah, and that's
We're relying upon it.
So NOAA is the one that controls that. They base their tidal predictions off of a 19-year record, and I think the last record that they used for these predictions in Charleston ended in around 2002. So these predictions are about 20 years old now, and that matches with the rise that we've noted over that period.
Stephen, a quick question. Where is this measured from? Is there a buoy or?
This is in Charleston Harbor.
So using the harbor buoy?
This is using the harbor setting, but we also looked at Wrightsville Beach, Spring May Pier, and Fort Pulaski in Georgia,
Okay.
and it's the same signature up and down the coast along the southeast.
But we don't have anything localized within our 2 inlets or off our shoreline?
No, there's nothing that would provide this level or this record now. There is a group that is installing some more tide gauges on our inland waterways.
Okay.
So we will have a better localized record. But yeah, I'd love to have a water gauge off the pier here and
Yes.
really be able to.
Okay.
I got one. Has there been an historical event like this where we've had an increase and then it's tapered back down?
Yeah, so sea level, it's one of those, it's a very tricky, complicated thing, but the way sea level generally changes is it's a roller coaster, and that roller coaster has been trending up, and so it's kind of stair steps where you'll get a couple of years of a rapid rise and then it'll level off or even fall. And so that's certainly true, but what we've seen lately is that that stair has gotten taller, and we haven't seen it flatten off yet. And it's likely to flatten off, it's likely to even fall somewhat. And we try not to be the sea level doomsday folks, but this is just measured data over the past 10 years. You know, we're not really trying to overcomplicate it with that. If we go back further, sea level was rising about 2 to 3 millimeters per year the past 100 years. Over this past 10 years, it's been about 12 to 15 millimeters per year, so almost half an inch per year. So it's been a significant little jump. All I'll say here is this is the total volume change on Isle of Palms and across the state, but the last 2 years, we've seen much more erosion. We've seen almost 500,000 yards of sand lost from the beach each of the past 2 years on Isle of Palms, which if you go back has been by far the highest amounts of erosion we've seen over the past 10 years.
So we're net right now under 1 million where we were about 1 million 2 years ago?
This is with nourishments removed.
Yep.
So if you add in the nourishment quantity, we'd be in the plus.
But we haven't had anything in the last 2 years, have we?
Not in the last 2 years, yeah,
So
correct.
We're from 2 years ago right now, we're net under, we've lost about 1 million cubic yards.
Correct.
Okay.
So what was the cause in 17 and 20 where we gained? What was, no, this is without
Oh,
nourishment.
you're right.
This is natural, right?
Right, and depending on when those dates were actually calculated, this was using the state's database of beach profiles, so that 53 positive might
Take it
include
away.
some nourishment, so I wouldn't focus on that too much, but there are years where you do gain sand, and that's either from the shoals coming on shore. These calculations stop before you get into all the delta sand, so it could be some of that sand moving onto the beach. And you know, you might have areas of the island that are gaining a lot of sand while other areas are losing even more. So it's not necessarily representative of the whole island. So we do our monitoring. We have 7 reaches identified where we look at detailed volume changes. Just along the east end, we've lost about 250,000 yards last year. We've lost about 1.4 million yards since 2018, since the project. And that is a pretty high number. It represents about 90% of the field. It's a little deceptive though, because most of that erosion has occurred in the area where we didn't fill a whole lot, right around the beach club and beach club villas in Wild Dunes. That area has actually lost a ton of sand, whereas the areas that were more critically eroded around Beechwood and Grand Pavilion and further north around Shipwatch and Ocean Club have actually held up pretty good. So you really, you kind of have to look at the details to know site by site. However, we're losing sand about twice as fast as we did after the 2008 project, if you add it all up over the east end. I will say that with the shoal attaching that I'll get into in a minute, those numbers are probably going to improve because sand's going to be coming onto the beach. So we're going to be gaining some here very soon. I will flip back real quick and just look at the trends over time for each of the reaches. Your front beach area is reach 2 and 3. Reach 4 is the center part of the island. Reach 5 and 6 are your Wild Dunes areas. Obviously, Wild Dunes has lost a lot of the nourishment. Reach 4 has been continuing to gain sand as that sand is spreading from the area. But reaches 2 and 3, and especially reach 1, which is Breach Inlet, just showed significant decreases in sand the past year. And I'll flip through the shoal here real quick, and again, I'll move through it fairly quickly, but this is the last 4 years, and if you focus on, this is August 23, the shoal now is right here. I'll flip back and you can see how from 2020, the channel is coming through here, a new channel breaches through, and all this sand is migrating to the beach. So 2022 to 2023, we've seen a very significant shift, and I think the shoal's actually moving a lot faster than previous shoals have. I was expecting it to take 2 to 3 years last year, and it's probably going to be getting close to attaching sometime in the next 12 months based off of the rates that we've seen. It's a much wider shoal, north to south, than we've seen in recent years, anytime since 2007. So I think it contains a lot of sand. It's going to be a big benefit over time. We also see kind of a smaller isolated shoal that's closer to Grand Pavilion area that's helping hold that beach in place. So I'm optimistic that the erosion associated with this shoal is not going to be as severe as erosion we've seen in the past, but it's still just a little too early to tell that for sure.
Stephen, I think it would be helpful to explain the dynamics of when a shoal is attaching. It's good because it's bringing new sand to the system, but it also creates erosion hotspots on either end.
Yeah, let me see if I have a better, I don't think I have a better picture of that, but if we go back to kind of that first picture that I showed of the 1997 project, you can see that, you know, again, you're getting this package of sand for free, but the way it changes those wave dynamics is it often has this dramatic erosion associated with it. It's temporary, and usually it's about a 2 to 3 year cycle from the time the shoal's causing the severe erosion until it's renourished the beach. But if you have structures that are in place, you know, that's obviously the issue we have.
Stephen, how accurately can you all predict the direction and location that's going to attach, and I guess kind of more importantly, the either end of the attachment where we have the erosion?
Yeah,
Can you get that down to 100-yard kind of give or take accuracy?
in the ballpark. I will say, as the sand kind of moves south, like we've seen it the past 2 years, there's been a significant southerly shift. It will start to move straight landward. It stops more of that southern migration and starts coming directly onto the beach because the inlet's not pushing it as far. And all that's based off the weather. And if we have weather patterns that are different than typical, then it could change. So again, it's kind of hard to predict with certainty. If we have more winds out of the north, it's going to push that shoal further south. But as it does get closer, based off the current configuration, I would say the area east of Mariners Walk is probably the most vulnerable on the eastern side. While we're getting a lot of erosion around Beechwood and a little to the west of there, I don't think it's going to be as acute as some of the past storms. So I think for the next 12 months, we are going to see erosion in that area, and that's why we're looking at sandbags that will help us sustain that. But I can't tell you for sure exactly, you know, lot by lot, house by house, you know, how bad is it going to get. What we did see, sorry, I go on too long sometimes. What we did see sometimes with the last shoal, where there was a very large extension of sand to the south, that sand really never came up to the beach. It kind of worked along the low tide underwater portion of the profile further down coast. So we didn't get some of the accretion that we were hoping to get with the last one.
Does the accelerated nature of this shoal movement also accelerate the erosion, or does it decelerate it? I mean, if this thing's moving faster, does it not have as much time to eat away, or do you even know?
I think it would be more beneficial just by a shorter duration of, you know, fewer tidal cycles that these waves are hitting the beach at that angle. It should be a benefit to it. The disadvantage is it's moving faster because there's bigger waves pushing it.
Yeah.
All right. Down coast areas, and here we'll just focus on Reach 1 is this breach inlet area. You see how things were fairly stable. There was some erosion and some accretion occurring in 2020, 2021. We saw a good bit of recovery of that area, but then starting in 2022, it dropped back down and then really saw a ton of erosion this past year. Same is true in Reaches 2 and 3 along Front Beach. Those have been fairly stable, but saw significant decreases this past year. And yeah, I'd love to tell you there's a very specific cause of that, but it's just a weather condition situation that happened. There could be a little less sand coming in from the upcoast areas, but it's just one of the kind of uncertainties with dealing with sand transport on the coast.
Steve, what are the streets for Reach 2 again, please?
Reach 2 on this map goes essentially from the, I have to zoom on to it. Yeah, it's basically the commercial district from the pier, and I think it's about 6th, 5th or 6th. And all of that'll be detailed in our annual report where we go kind of almost line by line down the beach with volumes. But Again, over this past year, we lost about 500,000 yards. That's more than we've seen any time in the past 12 years by double. This map, or this crazy chart down here at the bottom, I'll just point out real quick, is this line here is the project limit of our 2018 project. The tan line, anything above 0 shows accretion. And what we see with the tan line and then this lighter blue line, the darker blue line, and as you move south, that's a wave of sand that's coming from that 2018 project down coast. So we're able to track the accretion moving down coast from the project area. But by 2023, it's really stopped close to the pier, a little bit north of the pier. We're losing the signal of that sand. Now, certainly sand is still moving from the north to the south, but you're not getting a big package of sand. So it's kind of just dissipating over time. And that's useful because I know some concerns on, did that project cause changes, down at the south end? And this would suggest that there's really not much of a link between, direct impacts of that project and what's going on along the front beach area, the commercial district, and even in the inlet. What's going on in the inlet's really associated with some changes down there.
I've got a question. If we were to accelerate the beach renourishment and do it sooner instead of later, would that have any negative impact on the shoals, or would it just create a bigger buffer zone for the future?
Generally, it would be beneficial. You would want to make sure that when you're designing your placement scenarios, you're kind of working with the shoals and anticipating where the beach is going to build out and where it's going to erode. We made some last-minute adjustments on the 2018 project because of recent changes in the beach that occurred within months of us placing it. We were seeing a lot more erosion along that center section, so we went back and added sand to that middle section. But there's no potential downfall of it other than it's just costing some.
Could be a huge upfall, right? Because you could have more beach than you've had in a long time.
Right, and that's similar to where we were in 2018. We were right on the heels of an attachment process. So all that added to the volume that we were doing. We had an incredibly wide beach along the entire stretch.
So is it maybe a better time to do it now than it would be to wait another couple of years, if it was feasible to do it?
It's difficult to say. I think the strategy that we were looking at is doing another recycling project to try to buy time for that shoal to completely attach and see how the beach responds to that, and then we could work. If that bought us 5 years, then I think you're better off waiting to implement a large-scale project because of just the cost of it. However, if it didn't give us the quantity that we needed to have a sustainable beach to last us even through the beginning phases of a next shoal, then yeah, you would probably want to go ahead and pull the trigger on it. Again, I don't think there's a specific downside of it, but there may be a lower cost, lower level of effort to get you a sustainable beach for the next 3 to 4 years.
But the risk is it takes a long time to organize it and get it set up and get the permission and work with everybody.
Correct.
So the danger, I guess, is if you wait too long, it could be devastating.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think historically, the rationale has been that, I'm gonna pull numbers out of the hat, but at a $15 million project, an example, I think the mobilization cost of that is like a third or a half of it. So the more frequently you do it, you're hitting kind of a $5 million cost just to set up. So over 10 years, if you do 3 instead of 1, you're adding $10 million to the total cost. So that's kind of that's the rationale for spreading them out and doing kind of Band-Aids in the middle versus kind of every few years doing a major project.
Yeah, you wanna wait until you have enough of a project area that justifies that big mobilization cost.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Is most of that end of the island looks pretty good right now. It's it's a dozen houses, maybe a little more, and we know that number will grow over time if nothing's done. But it's not 2 miles of the beach, so we try to scale your projects to fix those isolated areas.
And you weigh the cost of protecting those homes versus the cost of doing a full project at this point. Okay.
Well, I think you look at the different alternatives. So the cost of doing like the sand recycling project that can be permitted probably within 12 months or less and implemented fairly quickly, as opposed to larger scale project that may take 2 years to permit. And I think having both tools though available is really our recommendations. Is let's have both options available and pick which one we think, is the best for that particular time.
And part of this proactive B goal here, are we looking at maybe, the permitting process is the long haul, it sounds like. So are we looking, or maybe we look at, how do we invest some money?
How do we invest some money in the permitting process ahead of time? Because I think these have a 5-year life with a 5-year extension to position us so that that is taken out of the timeline. I think we know within a 10-year period, we're gonna need all of these things, and maybe proactively we can position ourselves with some permits. Well, I don't know what they cost, $100,000 or something for each. Are they, well, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the sand recycling permits are a lot lower lift,
Yeah.
so they're a lot more simple, and we're getting ready. I mean, we have drawings kind of put together for that. I'm getting ready to submit that permit application, and part of that's gonna be having a public meeting, understanding that if you're trying to take sand from portions of the beach and recycle it, that means the owners along that portion of the beach where you're harvesting sand from need to understand why the project makes sense for them. So we're arranging to kind of have all that. So we've got the scenario laid out for that part. For the larger project, we've been communicating with SHPO and now have the agreement in place where we can meet with them and start that initial sand search and that coordination, because I think that's going to be the most significant part of it, is
Where are we getting it?
where we're going to get the sand from. And honestly, that's the biggest cost of your project is, or cost of a permit is finding good sand, but it's also the most significant part of your project, from the aesthetics, from how the beach looks and feels, how it recovers, and the cost of the project from the pumping standard. If you have to pump it from 4 miles away, it's much more expensive than if you can find a closer, better source of sand.
If, is there part of the permitting process that requires a municipality to prove a need? And can you just have one just because you want one, or do you have to be in an erosional cycle to
There's nothing
qualify, or?
Yeah, there's nothing in statute that specifies that you have to have a need for the action, but the way we typically approach a project like that is to have triggers in place in the permit that would only allow the work to be completed should the beach reach a certain condition. So it kind of gives them some certainty that we're not just going to go, move sand around for the heck of it, that it's actually needed. I'll just flip through this real quick on the breach inlet side, where we've noticed in 2019, here's a couple of photos of that area, and I think I showed this to council before, but circling the walkover that's been there, we saw a lot of natural accretion occurring from 2019 to 2021, and that was, based off the historic trend. What we were anticipating is that area, it fluctuates, but over the long term gains sand. So we felt pretty good about the situation in 2021. 2021 to 2022, we saw some erosion occurring, but most of that erosion was underwater. It wasn't visible in the beach, in the dry sand beach width or in the dune. But in 2023, starting around the middle of the year, we really started to see a lot of erosion of the upland beach. So it really kind of shifted the historical trend in that area. So about mid-2023, it was a very similar condition to where it was in 2019, but just continued to erode, obviously leaving us to where we're at today. Our thought is that is associated with just changes in the inlet channels. These are some models from Breach Inlet. I don't have the 2023 version on here. We're working that data up now, but essentially a new channel broke through in 2020, a lot closer to Isle of Palms, and that channel's been shifting to the south and towards Sullivan's Island. And as that's happening, the shoals, backwards here, the shoals have extended further towards Sullivan's Island and further to the south. And our feeling is that has been what's been drawing sand off that southern end of the island. There's been some talk about possibly opening up this channel as part of a mitigation project, and we can talk about the details of that. But that's a natural process that kind of occurs anyway. And I'm not sure that in this particular situation, while the benefits of it is you could take that sand and put it on the beach for nourishment activities, I don't know that it fixes the mechanics of the inlet that's going to cause that problem to continue in the future.
I'm sorry, Steve, can you go back? What was the circle on that, the black circle?
So that's what we call a marginal flood channel. That's another feature that can control the beach condition on an inlet. And that grew from 21 to 22. So there's just a deeper channel that takes some of the currents as the tide's flooding in And that can actually take some of the sand off the beach as well. So as that channel, and there's nothing that really controls that other than nature just kind of doing an episodic, migratory changes in the inlet. But it deepened and got a little bit bigger, and that might have also been contributing to some of the erosion that we've had occurring since then. So looking at what's going on in the future, the core project is expected to be awarded this month. The apparent low bidder for that is Aetna Dredging, who is currently doing the Murrells Inlet project for the core. They are, again, supposed to award that. It could start as early as March. I haven't spoken with Aetna, so I don't know if they're planning on using the same equipment, which would require them to finish the Murrells project before moving down here. I hope that it doesn't, because if it is, then it probably pushes our project another month or two into the future, because I think they're well over halfway done, but probably still have another at least month to 2 months of work up there. But all that's uncertain. And then that's going to place about 500,000 yards between 2nd Avenue and 9th Avenue. And that's plenty of sand to replace everything that's been lost over the past 10 years in that area. And I'll show you what that might look like here in just a second. I mentioned where we're at with the sand recycling project permit, and then what we're already doing with the beginning the stages of the large-scale nourishment permit. For the core project, I think somebody asked, what's that going to look like? This is a beneficial use project for the Corps, so they're not building a beach with it. They're just trying to get sand out of their borrow sources. So that's their primary concern, but it's going to be a benefit to the beach. But due to the nature of the sediment, they're going to be placing it below the high tide line to let it get into the water. The water will kind of stir it around and get any remaining fine material out, and the sand will be left in place. So that I'm expecting that will be placed somewhere in this kind of general area that's shown in the bracket, along the intertidal beach and maybe even out into the low tide water area. At high tide, the pipe will be out in the water. At low tide, it might be up on the beach. We're going to try to work with the contractor, and if the material is really good, encourage them to push the material as far landward as possible, which will get it up into the beach system more quickly. But any sand that's placed eventually will reestablish a natural profile, which means sand that's way out in the water is going to move up the beach and increase your dry sand beach over time. That may take a couple of weeks, it may take a couple of months, kind of depends on the weather. We've recommended that the city look at supplementing that natural process by mechanically moving some of that sand during the project and going ahead and rebuilding some of the dunes along that section, and even moving kind of a quantity towards the area south of 2nd Avenue to try to get the beach building, the underwater foundation of the beach in a better condition. I highly expect that if they start placing sand at the south end within days, a lot of that sand is going to be moving south and starting to rebuild that area. But it's going to take time for it to move up into the profile and really widen out the dry sand beach. But from day one, it will be benefiting that very southern tip of the island that's eroding right now.
When you say take time, are you talking weeks, months, year?
Weeks to a couple of months. I don't think years by any means. I think, a couple of weeks.
And that is if we don't do anything, as
Yeah,
you're recommending.
Right. Even if we didn't do anything, this project should be a substantial benefit to the dry sand beach and dune over time. It'll just take a lot longer. I say a lot longer. It'll take into the summer. You would have a dry sand beach from that sand, and a lot of that material will move up into the dune over time.
But we are planning on accelerating that by mechanically moving some of that sand upland.
Right, probably moving on the order of 50 to 75,000 yards, maybe a little bit more, if it's accessible, to jumpstart the dune building process and to get that dry sand berm in front of the areas that are critically eroding now. Last slide here. State funding has been available for our last project. Right now, that fund is currently essentially exhausted. Y'all were able to kind of take the last little bits of funds out of that for some of the work going on now. But there's not been a new appropriation of funds to kind of count on for future work. So that's just something to keep in mind. I know there's a lot of push to get permanent state funding put in place. We talked about the Wild Dune Shoal and all that. But So I guess that's the rest of it. So
Thank
happy
you.
to pull those back up. if
Yeah,
we-
thank you, Stephen. So again, just from a level setting standpoint, that was great. Thank you for doing that. So let's talk about kind of next steps and who you might like to have in front of you. Desiree, Douglas, and I kind of had some initial thoughts on, do you want OCRM here at some meeting? Do you want somebody else from a state level? Can't remember who else we had on the list, but what's your thinking around other experts you might want to hear from as we start formulating a path? Any thoughts on, Scott?
Yeah, I think for those of us that went up to the recent conference, there was a plethora of experts, and I think people that can talk about some forward opportunities. I think we met one that was Paul Kays at the college up there, but I think having experts like from OCRM to come in and to talk to us, and some of these other academics and engineers who have had 30, 40 years of experience and are can bring us a view from outside of just the Isle of Palms, I think would be extremely helpful. So I think, if we can maybe tap into, and I know, Steve, you've got a lot of contacts up there with the organization, we may want to look at bringing some of those folks in to get us up to speed on what the future looks like. And I'll just say one other thing and stop talking, but I was a little taken aback by the reality that the demand for sand over the next decade or two is going to outstrip the supply. And that our, for this whole I really like this objective B about getting proactive, and I think we've got to look at new methods and new opportunities and how we're going to, shift from that retreat to preservation thing. So anyway.
So again, an OCRM
Yeah.
rep, maybe another coastal engineer type person, or this professor from Coastal Carolina. Desiree, go ahead.
I didn't want to waste an opportunity to ask Stephen to maybe from a very high level before we get further down the talking about experts and who we want to hear from. We've had some conversations about, particularly on the south end of the island, what options do we have to evaluate for longer term solution. We're very focused right now on the Army Corps of Engineers project, and we think that that is going to be very beneficial for that end, but thinking long term and being prepared in the event that it does not perform as well as we think it would be, or maybe doesn't last 5 years, and now we're 3 years from now, and we're still having an erosional cycle, which we hope it shifts, but if not, what are some of those options that we have discussed that we could pursue quicker today, concurrently, hopefully, with the Army Corps project, so that we are in a position to be able to execute a project in the event that we need to.
Sure. And going back to a couple of years ago, we knew that for this next round of permitting a large-scale project, we wanted to have an area where we focused on the south end, whether it needed it or not. So we had already kind of outlined what work would need to be done for identifying a new borrow area that was closer to the south end of the island. Right now, it's feasible to use the borrow areas that we know about on the east end of the island, should we have the SHPO coordination we need. But it would be much more economical if there was a new borrow area further south. So part of our work we're doing is going to be looking at the opportunities for sand there, which would also require a lot of coordination with SHPO. So any permit application that we have for nourishment would include both ends of the island, regardless of really the sediment source. And we actually did that on the last permit too. We had a fill option for the south end if the condition hadn't restored itself before the project was done, but the accretion kind of was going on there. There are other potential options, looking at like a terminal groin. That idea has popped up. That's something that we've done before, like the south end of Folly Beach County Park. We put in a terminal groin in 2013 that's been very effective. I guess the reason why that hadn't been looked at before in serious detail here is really because the beach has been very healthy down there. To install a groin, you have to demonstrate that there's been a long-term erosion rate where nourishment alone is not capable of holding sand in place.
What does that mean?
It's not defined specifically saying you have to lose 10 feet per year for 15 years or anything like that, but like in the case of Folly Beach County Park, they had done dozens of nourishments. The nourishments last a year, and then the beach is right back to critically eroded. South end of Debadew Island, we put in 3 groins, 2022. They were losing 20 feet per year. Off the conditions today, you know, if we had this kind of chronic erosion occurring in that end, then that's something we would have definitely be looking into. And that's something we can look into now in the future, is if this erosion cycle doesn't reverse itself, you know, is a terminal groin there a viable solution? And even if it does, if a groin's put in place and the erosion pattern reverses, the groin essentially buries itself and it's kind of there as a as-needed thing. So, but it hasn't been looked at before, again, because the beach has been healthy there up until this past year. So that's something that kind of long-term can be looked at. It requires a lot more analysis. You have to do a downdrift impact analysis as a required document for that. Installing a groin, you have to do a nourishment project to fill it so that it's not trapping additional sand that would be working there. So it's something that's feasible. Again, doing a dredging project of the inlet itself, I don't think is the best option. You would have to bring in an ocean certified dredge. So you're still looking at several $1 billion of mobilization, because you're seaward of the bridge, I think is the line that distinguishes that. And you're not guaranteed to really have any long-term protection other than you're placing some sand on the beach. The channel is going to readjust itself naturally, probably in the next year or two, based off of where it's at now. Yes.
I have one more question. When you talked about the Aetna dredging company, and they may not be here for another couple of months, is there anything, you know, we've got that beach renourishment emergency order for us now down through 314 Ocean. From 314 down to 8th is now getting, for lack of a better term, hammered. And I think you're trying to keep up as much as possible between Breach and 314. We've got some forecasted tides, higher tides coming in at the end of this month. We're going to have a February-March cycle. I'm hearing possibly we might have an April-May cycle before the dredgers can get up here. What can we do? They're losing ground very rapidly on those areas that aren't protected, and I think there's a daily replenishment on the ones that are protected. What should we be doing proactively to try to ensure that these homes don't get devastated and we end up losing some of the homes, and the beach accesses are also getting clogged up?
Right. Unfortunately, there's very little that the state allows us to do right now unless the homes are within 20 feet. And if the homes are within 20 feet, you're allowed to do the scraping, you're allowed to do sandbags. You can truck in sand at any point under a general permit. And we've done that in times where we've seen there's not enough sand to scrape. You know, there's been certain conditions where there's a ridge and a runnel, and the sand that you'd be able to scrape so far out that a dozer can't efficiently scrape it. Working with the state to allow us to dig deeper, further out, I think is one thing that I'd love to have the ability to do, so we're not limited to a 1-foot cut, because that essentially means you have to dig a much bigger area, very shallow, and it's just a slower process. But by their regulations, they don't allow us to do that right now.
I think some of these homes are getting close to the, I mean,
Yeah.
is there something we could do to monitor them either daily or every other day to?
Yeah, I mean,
They're losing it fast. I mean,
I know Doug has been checking in on them very regularly. You know, we did sandbags down there at one point. I think the brown sandbags that we're using up at the east end are a much better bag that hold up a lot better. You know, we could look at doing those again in those areas that are just, we can't keep pace with. They do work well, but if they are hit by a storm, then they will need to be maintained and moved. The advantage of these brown bags, even though they're much more expensive, is they can be shifted around after the fact. Essentially, those white bags, once they're placed, they're there, and if you try to move them, they rip.
One of the things that the mayor mentioned was, you know, who can we bring next time to a meeting that might help? And if we've got a state issue, maybe there's somebody from the state that we could invite so they can actually sit here and focus on it for an hour with us and talk about the issues and understand how significant it is. They're busy with a lot of things going on. It's hard to get somebody's attention for that much time. Who would that person be, or could you help us identify who that would be?
Yeah, I think it would be Matt Schlegel would be the one that can tell you.
OCRM.
Of OCRM. Their enforcement side, OCRM kind of gets stuck sometimes because they are completely bound by their regulations. They do not have the authority to tell you can do something that they could say makes sense, but if the regulations don't allow them to do it. They can't tell you can do it. But they've been very good about trying to work with the city and being as responsive and flexible as they possibly can be. I would think Matt would be a good start. Their enforcement person, they need to get together to be able to make sure that they're on the same page, even internally with OCRM. You know, some of the higher up folks have been down here and met with some of the, so they're.
Who regulates OCRM, the state?
Yes.
Okay, so maybe we should invite a representative here.
Yeah, so let's
To
talk,
sit with
because I know we need to break up real quick. So let's think about our next meeting and kind of time frame. I mean, is it Fridays? I know work best for some, maybe most. I don't know how, we'd have to just check schedules for OCRM or whomever we want in here next. I mean, do y'all want to meet weekly or every other Friday or some other cadence?
I will not be here next Friday.
Okay.
I think we should try to meet more frequently as in weekly at this point. It sounds like we still have more catching up to do to get on a level playing field with y'all, which would include, at least I don't know what our financial, position is, what do we have to play with? And as we're trying to move forward with emergencies and future, we need to also be, whether it's applying for grants or whatever we need to be doing to have the funds to do this, particularly if we aren't in the position we hope we are, if Mother Nature works on our side. But right now, it's not working on our side. So I think we need to go ahead and check our checkbook and figure out how we can enhance that as well. So representative would be great. But I do think it's going to take a little while for us all to get up to speed, so more meetings are better, and then maybe we can
I think that's fine.
taper it down when we
Or
feel like
next
we've
Friday.
got some under control.
Yeah,
Thursday
that's
morning.
fair.
Every other week would be ideal. It's
Yeah.
a little hard to build a schedule around it.
Yeah. Desiree, go ahead. Were you gonna say anything?
I mean, we'll be here.
Yeah.
However, however frequent we want to meet, we'll be every Friday we'll be prepared.
Not
No
every
Fridays
Friday,
off,
yeah.
Douglas, for the foreseeable
Well, and I
future.
just think, we're just gonna have to go, to your point, if we meet every week, we meet. If people can make it, great. If we can't, I think we just keep rocking.
And as long as we keep good notes and can share, I mean, clearly not everybody can be here every single
Yeah.
meeting, but I would set a standard time and so we can all start planning for that. And then when it looks like we've got things under control, we can go back to less often.
Yeah.
So we
let-
can meet next Friday at 9 if that works for the group. Is that a good time for everybody, at least to
Yes,
set it
yes.
out?
It's
think
not for
we-
me, but don't stop. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
I mean, Katie's not gonna be able to be here, Dan.
Is there a better day of the week for people? Is it Friday that's bad? I know I can't be here next Friday
I've
either.
got two
but
bad Fridays coming up, and that's the problem.
That's
So
me
maybe we
too,
should put
yeah.
this one out next
I have
Friday
two
then?
bad Fridays too. The next two are bad and then I'm good after that. So maybe
So what about next Thursday?
that's fine for me.
Thursday morning?
Maybe Thursday afternoon, I know.
Yeah, I can do afternoons, and again, and don't let my
Yeah,
participate,
I
because I'm the
can't do
weird one
Thursday
here,
afternoon.
so.
We have an environmental committee.
Yeah, I think let's go with Friday mornings at 9 and let's just keep rocking.
Okay.
I just think it's gonna be so hard to coordinate 10 people's calendars. I think we just do that and take good notes and
And what we can
see
do,
who we can get from a scheduling
That's right.
standpoint for our next one.
it sounds like we want to hear from OCRM at our next meeting,
Definitely.
so we'll make that request of Matt Slagle and anybody else from his team that he think
Yeah.
would be good. We can also include and maybe focus our agenda with, on OCRM and maybe the funding piece. Maybe
Yeah,
we can
because of
have
financials.
a financial analysis of where we are and where we think we will be and how these projects play into that.
Right, and then where we might be looking for funds based on our situation.
Correct.
Will we be able, is it possible to have a phone in? Like, I know like this coming Friday, I could be on a call, I just couldn't be physically
I
here.
could too, same
And the
thing.
next Friday, I
could do a
think I'm
phone,
not
yeah.
available.
Yeah, we
but
can.
That would be awesome.
Yeah,
You
it's a
can
little
call in.
kludgy, but
Because
we can do
clearly we
phone
wanna
for
be
sure.
here.
Yeah,
Are
let's,
we trying to keep this to an hour?
yes.
I mean, okay, so if we are, should we really hit OCRM hard and find out what all of our options are, and then the next Friday deal with funding?
Maybe.
I mean, rather than try and have two, what
Yeah.
seem like pretty big issues
Yeah.
in the same,
I mean, it's really
Maybe.
gonna depend on Matt's schedule more than
Correct.
anything.
If he
so-
can make it, we'll go down
Sure.
that route.
Yeah.
If not, we'll switch and do the funding piece on Friday and then.
And if we've got a number of people calling in, should we get a conference bridge in the middle of the day instead of everybody calling in on there?
We'll see what we can do.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Our equipment's pretty limited here, mister, as you know, so we'll see. To our residents, council has to, but to our residents, thank you all for being volunteered, told.
Thank you.
We really appreciate y'all's input. This is great, and staff for coordinating as always, and Stephen, always a thank you on your side. Anything else before we wrap? Good level set. All right, 10:15, we are off record. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.